Thank you so much for coming out and joining us today. My name is Andrea Bynum. You see my name in the program beside welcome and introduction, so I will take care of that welcome. Thank you so much. I'm very excited about the presentation today. We have some folks here today that have been so nice in accepting our invitation to come out. I want to have Janet Sellers, the EEO director, to come. She's going to actually introduce our speaker today. And also we want to spend some time with a few special acknowledgments of those people who have blazed a trail for all of us who stand here today. Janet?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I am just so pleased to see the great turnout today for our special Women's History Month commemoration. The theme for Women's History Month is celebrating women of courage, character, and commitment. And there is no better way, I believe, to celebrate that theme than to recognize the women of NASA Langley Research Center and NACA, the contributions they have made to the Hampton Roads area, to the nation and to the world are just immeasurable. They're just absolutely immeasurable. And I'm just so pleased and so thrilled that so many ladies could come out today and celebrate with us. And I'd like to give them a round of applause right now. There's some special individuals I'd like to recognize. We are just absolutely thrilled to have Katherine Johnson and James Johnson here to celebrate with us. Dr. Christine Darden, Gloria Champagne, Billie Jean Neal, Sue Johnson, and Catherine Smith. We are just so excited that you guys could be with us today. Also, Michelle Woods-Jones, the Executive Director of the Unity Commission for the City of Hampton. Thank you so much for attending our celebration today. And now on to a little bit about our guest speaker. Margot Lee Shetterly is a founder of the Human Computer Project, a digital archive dedicated to profiling all of the women who worked as computers at NASA and NACA. The project, a collaboration with Macalester College Professor of American Studies, Dr. Duchess Harris, explores the historical role of women in the development of aeronautics, astronautics, and modern computing. She is also author of the forthcoming book, Hidden Figures, a history of NASA's African-American female mathematicians. She's a native of Hampton, Virginia, the daughter of retired NASA Langley Research Center and research scientist, Dr. Robert Lee, and Bob also used to be the EEO director for a while in my office, a little bit before my time, but still, good guy, good guy. Thanks, Bob. And retired Hampton University English professor, Dr. Margaret G. Lee. Margot is also the co-founder of Inside Mexico, which from 2006 to 2009 was Mexico's most widely distributed English language publication. Margot is a 91 graduate of the University of Virginia. She currently lives in Valle de Bravo, Mexico, with her husband, Aaron. And now, without further ado, I present to you Margot Shetterly.
Thank you, Janet, for that amazing introduction. Good morning to everyone. Happy spring. It's the first day of spring, and it feels a little bit like spring right now. And I also want to say thank you to all of the people who have really helped put this together today. At the top of the list, Andrea Bynum. Andrea has been incredible. Every single detail that has been involved with chasing this down and pulling this event together, she's handled it. And so I really want to say a special thank you to her. Also to Joanne Belchis and to Marie Heyman. I'm sorry if I'm getting the right names, not quite right, the last names, but I know we've only had a little bit of contact, but I know that you guys have also been working really hard on this event, and I thank you very much for making it happen. Mary Gaynor, who couldn't be here today, Mary is the Langley NASA historian. And Mary not only supported this event today, but for the last 2 years, she's been very helpful in terms of helping me with the research in the archives here, digging into the documents and really understanding this history. So I want to say a thank you to Mary. Also to Donna Speller-Turner, who has been just so energetic and very helpful in terms of helping me to get the lists organized and make sure that all of the women very important to this day, have been, got invitations and knew to come here. Gloria Champagne, with whom at this point I've spent many hours on the phone, and I'm looking forward to spending many hours in person, and who I think we probably met when I was much younger, and it's been wonderful to get to know you, and I look forward to spending more time together. And then very special thank yous to Ms. Catherine Johnson and to Dr. Christine Darden, with whom at this point, I don't know how many hours I've spent with those two wonderful ladies, but they have shared their memories, their stories, and they have given me a real primer on aeronautics and space science, which was very much needed for me in doing this project. And then the final thank you I want to say, acknowledgement, is to a woman whose name is Beverly Galimba. Miss Galimba in 1990 had the foresight to record the stories of some of the computers, the ladies who worked here as computers at NACA and at NASA over the years, and understood that that was an important history. So she interviewed 13 of these women and wrote a study on them. And she's never really been given the credit that's due, but this manuscript, which was never published, has been a real reference work for a number of people who have been interested in this history and interested in human computers. So I think this is a really good occasion to acknowledge the work that she's done, which has been very helpful to me in the work that I'm doing now. And what I'd like to do is to just start with, this is the first sentence from her manuscript. This was written in 1990. So 24 years ago, but it could have been written today. The attitude toward women in science, although somewhat improved, still treats this as an emerging phenomenon, and while young women are presently being encouraged to go into the sciences, the long history of women in science is unknown to them. And what I'd like to do today as a part of Women's History Month is to expand on that history, to really build on that history and help us understand that history, because by understanding the history, we create a more inclusive environment, my theory is, for bringing more women and more girls into the sciences. Now, NASA today is an extremely inclusive organization, and you can see here at the very top levels of NASA, there are lots of women in a variety of different roles. Science roles, center directors, including the director here at Langley, Lisa Rowe, who is now Deputy Associate Administrator at NASA headquarters. But the reason why these women are able to be in the positions that they are and influencing the policy and the science that's being done at NASA today has very much to do with the female pioneers who came to NASA and to its predecessor, the NACA, back in the 1930s and 1940s through the 1950s and 60s. And so what I'd like to do today is to honor the achievements of those women so that we can understand the path that brought these women and the women who are to come into the executive positions and the policy roles that they're in today. So you probably want to know a little bit more about me and a little bit about why I'm here. I do see some familiar faces, and I'm sure those familiar faces are wondering, well, what is Margot doing up on the stage today? My name is Margot Lee Shetterly. I'm from Hampton, Virginia. I grew up here. As you heard a little bit earlier, my mother, Dr. Margaret G. Lee, is a retired Hampton University professor. When I was a little girl and I was going to Captain John Smith Elementary School, which many of you may be familiar with, I was in the spelling bee, and my mother would sit me down when I was participating in the spelling bee, and she would go over all of the words until I could spell and define the hardest words in Webster's Third New International Dictionary. And my father, who is a retired Langley NASA research scientist over here, when I was in high school, he made me take a lot of math and science courses. I took calculus, and I would sit down at the kitchen table, and I would work the calculus problems. He would make me work them until they were correct. So I'm here today. I guess it's inevitable that I would become somebody who would write about scientists. So I lived here in Hampton. I went away to the University of Virginia. I moved to New York, and then I moved to Mexico, where I live right now with my husband. But I've always been from Hampton. I'm still from Hampton, and Hampton has always been my home. This is a place that I come back to. and I come back with my husband. A couple of years ago, we were back visiting my family, and when we're back in Hampton, we do Hampton things. We go to Harpoon Larry's to eat. We go to the Hampton University Museum and go to Buckrow Beach. And one particular day, we went to church with my parents at First Baptist Church. And we ran into, after service that day, we ran into an old Sunday school teacher, Miss Kathleen Land, which many of you may have known. And Miss Land was a formidable woman who, well into her 90s, never missed a Sunday at church. So we had a nice conversation that day with Miss Land. And my father said in the car on the way home, well, you know, Miss Land was a computer at Langley. And so I thought about that. And then he started to give some more names of women who had worked as mathematicians, who had worked at computers out at Langley. Miss Katherine Johnson, Vivian Adair, there were Virginia Tucker. There were many names that I remember hearing when I was a little girl. And that really took me back to a time when I would come out here to Langley. It was such a treat to visit my father in his office. It was so exciting because it was so grown up and smelled like coffee. And back then, the offices, they also smelled like cigarettes, which I guess they probably don't anymore. And there were always so many women. There were lots of women, a diverse group of women, women of all colors, women of all ages. And some of the women there were my grandmother's age. But it never occurred to me to question why they were there. It just seemed that this is a science organization, and these women are scientists. They're participating in the scientific process. And it wasn't until many years later that I left Hampton and left Langley and realized that that wasn't the way the world worked. And it wasn't until that day that it occurred to me to ask the question, how did those women come to Langley? How did they get there? And so the next Sunday after church, I spent some time with Miss Land, speaking with her about her time here as working as a computer, as a mathematician. And then I think it was a week after that, my mother arranged for me to meet with Miss Katherine Johnson. And I remember Miss Johnson when I was 12 years old. My mother's sorority had a pageant called Little Miss Fashionetta. And I was a participant in this, and I think Miss Johnson was the president of the sorority at the time, and she was very organized and very serious, and I was very intimidated. But the time that I've spent with her, learning her story and understanding the work that she did, the importance of the work that she and these other women did, has been remarkable. It's really been transformative for me, and it created a curiosity that's turned into a passion. From her story, I got to know Dr. Christine Darden, and I've gotten to know Gloria Champagne, who was, although she was not a computer, Miss Champagne has put me in touch with many of the computers and the ladies that she knew, and she has been like a walking NASA history book. She knows so many people and so much about what happened in the old days of the NACA. And so this process of understanding this history, really out of that came two projects. The first is a book which is going to be published in 2016 about the history of the African American women who came to work at NASA Langley, starting really during World War II. But in the course of the research of that book, what I realized is that the entire story, there was a larger story here, that many of the women, their stories hadn't been recognized, and that before this history slips out of our fingers, it's really important for us to chronicle the work that these women did. Without the work that these women did, there would not be not just the space program, but aircraft, a lot of the advances in computing. And so really, the importance of what I'm doing, I think, is to put the stories of these women on the historical record, and to really, so that we can all celebrate the foundational work that they did. So what I'd like to do now, if you'll indulge me, is to take everyone through a little bit of the history. The great thing about this is I've learned so much, not just about these women or about aeronautics, but also about Hampton Roads. I think the thing that we have to remember, and today it's very difficult for us to sometimes think of it, but history was made right here in Hampton Roads. This is where we're from. This is our backyard, and I think that's one of the things that's so exciting about this, that we can take pride in being from this area and celebrating this history from people who have come from our community. So I'm going to walk through the history, and I think it's really important that everyone take notes because there's going to be an exam. But don't worry, the history exam is going to be a lot easier than the calculus exam my father's going to give you after that. So, and with all exams, of course, the bonus questions are very important. So first of all, I'd like to give a bonus question. Langley has been here for many decades now, and it's been a real economic motor for the area. But how many people know the important industries in Hampton before Langley came? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts. Seafood? It was shipyard, but although that was Newport News, but dairy. Well, farming, agriculture was a big one, and tourism was another. So Buckrow Beach. But one of the things about studying history are the surprising things. The other industry that was extremely important to Hampton before Langley came here was liquor. And so here, this is an article from the Richmond Times-Dispatch from 1935, but it's commemorating 20 years of Langley being in Hampton and talking about how before Langley came to Hampton, and people were extremely concerned because during Prohibition, they shut down the liquor industry. A lot of people were employed in the liquor industry here in Hampton. It was called Elizabeth City County then. And so there were a couple of very enterprising entrepreneurs here in Hampton who realized this was coming and thought, well, we've got to do something to save the economy here. And they got wind of this aeronautical laboratory that the country was looking to locate someplace in the country. And the NACA, which was founded in 1915, which came out of a need of the United States to improve its position in aeronautics vis-a-vis countries in Europe. Germany, the UK, France were all more advanced than the United States at that time. They looked at 16 different locations around the country when they were looking to locate this aeronautical laboratory. One of the requirements was that it be near water so that they could test over water flying. Another requirement was that it be not too far from Washington, D.C. And at that time, Hampton was just an overnight steamer ride from Washington, D.C. So Hampton, Virginia was the site that they selected. And in 1917, they broke ground. And both that year, both the Langley Field, the Langley Flying Field, which was an Army installation at the time, and the NACA's laboratory were broken ground. And actually, the laboratory, what we know now as the Langley Research Center, started operations in 1920 with 4 scientists and 11 support staff. And that, I think that image is just amazing because you can drive around Hampton and imagine, drive across that and imagine what it looked like in 1919. Some of these photos, that's been one of the exciting things about this work. Now, in 1922, Pearl Young, who was a graduate, an engineering graduate of the University of North Dakota, became the first female employee here at the laboratory. Now, she was an engineer, but what she really did was distinguish herself as a technical editor. So when the NACA was just getting off the ground and really having to communicate its findings with, not just internally, but with the military, with the Army, with the aircraft industry, Pearl Young said, well, we really need to have a way to do that is organized so that we're sort of consistent in our communications with all of our stakeholders. So she became the first technical editor, and a lot of the style, a lot of the procedures that she implemented back then still have influence over NASA communications today. So she was quite an influential person in the history of Langley. And there's actually a theater, the Pearl Young Theater and Center here that is named to commemorate her work and her importance in the history of Langley. Now, it's really in 1935 that we start to see a critical mass of women coming to the center. This is a photo of Virginia Tucker, and I'm sure many of you may remember her. But she came in 1935 with five other women. I'm sorry, 5 women total, 4 other women, and they formed the first computer pool. So this was an experiment on the part of the engineers here at Langley, and the idea was that centralizing the work, similar to a clerical pool, would result in a much more efficient way to process all of the data that was coming out of the wind tunnel test, the flight test. And so the first 5 computers were really an experiment. But this turned out to be such an amazing thing that the numbers started to grow here. And I think one of the things that's really important to say, in the 1930s, this was a new thing. Most of the women with college degrees who studied mathematics taught mathematics. So the fact that there was a job opening as a professional mathematician was really quite a revolutionary thing. As a research mathematician, as computers, this was an entirely new job category for women, and really something that was quite revolutionary in terms of workplace opportunities for women. But there was a little bit of a double-edged sword, because at the same time that this was a new category for women, this was still considered sub-professional work. So it was a step above clerical work, but it wasn't the same as engineering work or mathematicians. And what's really interesting in going through some of these documents and looking at the history is that a woman was hired, generally speaking, as an SP3, and I don't think that's a category that existed beyond the 1950s in terms of the civil service. But she might actually be doing the same work as somebody who was hired in as a mathematician. A man who had a math degree, generally speaking, would have been hired as a mathematician, or an engineering aide or an engineer. But very often, these women, very talented, were doing the same work, but were hired in as a sub-professional. So there's an interesting dichotomy between the opening of this new opportunity, but women also being considered in the lower rank in the organization for the same work that they were doing. And of course, if you were a lower rank, you got paid less money. So it is an opening, but it is a little bit of a, mixed bag in terms of how that worked. Now, what did these women do? I've had sort of a real education in fluid dynamics and computing and how all of these things work, because I really had no idea. So one of the interesting things of this research has been actually understanding what was the work like. And the one thing that became very clear is that this was an incredibly important part of all of the work, the mechanical calculator. And so this is a Monroe model. I know that there were several other kinds. There was the Frieden calculator. There was the Marchant calculator. It sounds that everyone had their own preferences for the different calculators. And the calculators were very simple. And I think until later years, they didn't do square roots. So, and I've actually gone on eBay to look at these machines. You can buy many of them if you look around. And I think, I'm tempted to buy one to really understand how this works. So, but this I think is one of the things that's really important to understand, how important the calculator was to the work that the women did. Here's a picture of a computer that's reading film, and she's working with a Frieden calculator. You can see the model on the side. And afterwards, I just want to say that we'll have questions and answers after the presentation, and I would love if the people who lived the history have any comments and would like to correct anything or add to anything so that we really understand the exact work. But here's a picture of a woman who is reading film with her Frieden calculator. Now, this picture, when I look at this picture, I think you really get an understanding of how intense and how exacting and probably, how difficult at times this job was. But at the same time, this was extraordinary important work. Without this work, None of the experiments, the data reduction, all of the hard work of data reduction, data analysis, collecting the data, everything that we do and take for granted with one click of an Excel spreadsheet was done by these women, and it had to be right. This had to be done accurately, and when I see that picture, I think that it expresses probably how difficult it was and challenging it was many times. Now, by 1942, and this is, World War II has already started, and so the demands for aircraft production, aircraft research, all of this have skyrocketed, and just the demand for labor. So 1942, I found a memo between two engineers here at the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory, which is what it was called at the time. And they were discussing the computer pool, which had been wildly successful. So the engineers were recommending it to all of their contractors as a great model. And one of the things that came up over and over again in this memo was how well the women did the work and how much this added to the efficiency of the engineering operations. And so, but again, one of the issues was, the demands for computing were just skyrocketing, and this was work that had to be done. The engineers were then freed to do data analysis or conceiving the experiments, all of the things that electronic computers have freed us to do now, but this very important work was done by women. And so between 1935 and 1942, it looks like as many as 400 women were trained in the computer pool and then sent out to the different engineering organizations. And I think one of the things that I hope to do with this research is really to come up with some hard numbers on how many women came through the pool, because I think, and particularly during the 1940s and the early years, sometimes women came in and they stayed for a year or 2 years and then they left. Maybe they went and had a family. Sometimes they came and worked and they left and then they came back to Langley. There are many cases of that. But the true numbers of the official numbers of the total number of women who worked in this position over time, I think is greatly understated. So one of the things that I'm really hoping to do and solicit the help of everybody who is here and people is to get an accurate count so we can really represent the work of all of the women who are doing this over the years. Now, World War II also created some other changes in society. So in World War I, African Americans were largely shut out of the war jobs. And civil rights leader, including and particularly A. Philip Randolph, who was the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, was pressuring President Roosevelt to say, we would like African Americans to have full participation in these new war jobs. Well, that pressure resulted in Executive Order 8802, which came out in June 1941. And this decreed that the United States had to open its defense industry to all workers, regardless of discrimination of race, creed, or color, so that African Americans had to be included in these war jobs that was a real boom, and particularly in areas like Hampton Roads. So a couple of years later, what we see is the following. Now, this is an excerpt from an article of the Norfolk Journal and Guide, which is the local African American paper here in Hampton Roads. And it's a little notice. It was in a social column, comings and goings of people in Virginia. And the note is that Mrs. D.J. Vaughn, instructor in mathematics at the Farmville High School for several years, has accepted a position in Langley Field. And this is Dorothy Vaughn, which I think maybe many of you, I know many of you know, but Dorothy Vaughn was one of the earliest of the African American women who came to work as computers at Langley. So this photo, I think this is really remarkable. So this is a photo in November 1943. It's a war bond rally, so Secretary of the Navy Henry Knox came to Hampton, to Langley, for two reasons. One was to congratulate the NACA employees on their performance in the war bonds, because the employee purchases of war bonds led all of the other federal departments, so he came to congratulate them on that. The other thing was to congratulate them on the research that had led to the US victory in the Battle of Midway. So all of the employees came. They were assembled in the Structures and Materials Research Facility. And another part of the interesting part of this research is figuring out which buildings in these old photos are still here today and which of them are not. But this was the Structures and Materials Research Building. And I think this is remarkable. This is 1943 in Virginia, which still had segregation laws. And here is a crowd of people that is diverse in terms of race, it's diverse in terms of gender, it's diverse in terms of job category. You can see there are many people who are obviously workers or laborers. There are many people who are executives in the front. And so you can see, here's another close-up of the photo. There are lots of women there. And here's another blow-up, and if you look in the field there, you see many of the earliest African-American women who were computers. And one of them, the woman, the collaborator that I'm working with, Dr. Duchess Harris, who is at Macalester College, one of those women is her grandmother, and she couldn't believe it when she saw this photo that her grandmother was there. Her name was Miriam Mann, and she was started working here at 1943 as a mathematician. So, you know, when you look at those photos, sometimes a photo is worth 1,000 words, and I think that's a very good case of that. Of course, there was segregation, and this is a floor plan. Now, this is building 1227. My father and I were just looking out the window to see where 1227 was, and I think it's an electric plant or a parking lot right now. It doesn't exist anymore. But this was the West Area cafeteria, and you can see from the plans here that it was segregated. There was a colored dining room, there were colored bathrooms. So this, again, as there was this duality with women, also with the African-American women, these were new job opportunities, but at the same time, there were these laws of segregation. And here, this is a little clip from the Air Scoop employee newsletter, showing that the West computers, and that's what they were called, the African-American women were in the West computing section, has moved to the ALD building. So I've been trying to, you know, do a little detective work and figure out where all of these buildings were located, but they were segregated into their own office. But then what's also very interesting is, and these are all from the 1950s, that all of these African-American women were also extremely involved in all of the activities here at the center. So Dorothy Vaughan, who was helping with a group of computers compiling the computer handbook, learning, you know, instructing people on how to use the calculating machines. Catherine Pedrew, who was very active in the United Fund. Eunice Smith, who was a Christmas party Santa's helper. So at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of fluidity here at Langley in terms of women and in terms of the African-American women. Here's a 1950s Langley workroom. I think that gives a good sense of, you know, what did people do on a daily basis? How was the office laid out? And you see there are men and women. There's actually one of the African-American computers, Willie Ruffin, I think is her name, who's over there on the side. So you can see that as the women rotated through the different engineering groups, there was both racial integration, and a lot of times women of all races found permanent positions in different engineering sections. There's a picture of the supersonic pressure tunnel in the 1950s. Mary Jackson, who many of you know, is on the far right side there. Now, as the women reached a critical mass in terms of population, sheer numbers of women here at the center, and were really integrated into all of the operations, what we start to see is there are more women who are engineers and starting to do engineering functions. So this is Kitty O'Brien Joyner, who is a Langley engineer, and she also was the first female graduate in engineering at the University of Virginia. Mary Jackson. Now, Mary Jackson, this is a really interesting story. She was a teacher originally, and she joined the pool in 1951, the West Computing Pool. And clearly very talented woman, loved engineering, and found a mentor and an engineer called Kazimierz Sarnecki. And Engineer Sarnecki said to her, listen, if you want to be an engineer, you've got to get your master's degree. At that time, the extension courses of the University of Virginia for Langley, for people who wanted to move up through the ranks, were held at Hampton High School, which at the time was segregated. So Mary Jackson went and got a special permit from the city of Hampton so that she could attend these courses, and then went on to get her master's degree and was promoted to engineer in 1958. One of the first women of any race who was engineer here. Now this is a picture from a book called Spaceflight Revolution by a man named James Hansen. And I just want to clarify, this is author James Hansen, not climate science James Hansen. Mr. Hansen has written a number of very good books about Langley history, the early days of the NACA and the space program. And if you're looking to learn a lot of the detail, his books are excellent. But one of the things that struck me about this particular photo is that this was published in the book, these are the women who were women scientists at Langley in 1959, but there were no names. And you know, I wanted to know more about these women and what they did. I know they're women scientists, and you know, I think that's great to know that at that time there were women scientists. But there weren't any names, and I think that's sort of an example of women over the years really having contributed to the work and maybe not having been given all of the credit for the work that they should have had. 1957, Sputnik. I'm sure many of you here remember this. The Soviets launched their satellite Sputnik and basically take the Cold War into space. So the United States reaction to Sputnik, and here at Langley and the NACA, was to transform what was essentially an aeronautics research facility into a space facility, which we know today as NASA. So in 1958, NASA was created to continue the aeronautics research, but also to get the United States into space and become a leader in space research. So many of the women who were working originally in aeronautics were then drafted into the Space Task Group, which was the central group here in Hampton, Virginia. Before there was mission control in Houston, Hampton, Virginia was the center of the space world for a while, and many women were drafted into that group to do that work. Our special guest today, of course, many of you know about the work that Mrs. Johnson has done over the years. She started out in the pool in 1953, but very soon was rotated into an engineering group where her first assignment was to analyze the black box data from airplane crashes. But she and her engineers, the engineers that she worked with, were drafted into the Space Task Group. And there, instead of calculating, using the numbers from experiments to calculate airplane flights, the most important thing became to calculate trajectories, or among the most important things. Miss Johnson was responsible for calculating the trajectories for the early Mercury missions, including John Glenn's flight. And I think this is an anecdote that maybe many of you have heard, but I think this is interesting and important for a number of reasons. But John Glenn's flight was the first flight that really had a greater integration of electronic computing into the tracking and to the trajectory analysis. And so, of course, these days we take computers for granted. We trust the output for computers. When anything is new, you know, people are perhaps a little bit nervous. And at that point, John Glenn said, "Get the girl to check the numbers." And of course, many of the women here remember that it was all of the women were girls, regardless of their age. And Miss Johnson double-checked those numbers. They matched the computer, and the rest is history. But one of the things that I think is interesting, other than the fact that this is a really strong example of how women rise to the occasion in, you know, a very high-pressure scientific endeavor, all eyes on this man as he's going into space. And this is the woman who stood behind the man and checked the numbers. You know, I think this is, you can't have a better example of what women are capable of doing in a scientific organization. But the other thing that's really interesting is that it was a turning point in the history of computing, because after that moment, electronic computers really became fully integrated and started doing really more of the work that the women had been doing by hand. And then the job category started to transform from hand calculations of these numbers to managing computers, computer programming, managing systems. So again, we have a transformation in the job opportunity. The technology changes and the opportunity changes. Now this is, one of the things that's really wonderful about NASA and its sense of the historic mission is that from the very beginning, NASA has taken lots of photos. NASA has recorded many oral histories over the years. And so it's been really exciting for me to dig into the NASA archives. Many of these articles are on the NASA website, and read the first-person stories of the men and women who have been involved in this endeavor from the beginning. This particular oral history with a woman named Dorothy Lee, who started out here at Langley and ended up at the Johnson Center, the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. But she was a heat specialist for Mercury, Apollo, and the Space Shuttle. And I think she's a really good example because it shows the progression of women through the career cycles here. So originally, women first got the opportunity. They were computers and mathematicians. They started filling out in the engineering positions. And then the question is, well, if women can do this work, can they manage the work? Are women capable of managing in very high-pressure scientific positions and managing scientific organizations? Dottie Lee had a number of responsibilities in Mercury and also Apollo within the Space Shuttle. But this line, I thought it was just really great. So the night of her retirement party, one of the speakers said, "Dottie's retirement's a line item in our budget," because she was replaced by 10 men, 3 NASA guys, and 7 contractors. And it's a really interesting interview because she obviously was a very good engineer, but she became a very good engineering manager. And I think a real study, again, in how women are capable of filling any position in a scientific organization. Now, this is another familiar face here, and I've learned a lot from Dr. Darden. But I think this is, and by now we're in the 1970s, like really looking at the progression of women as they move up through this organization. Dr. Darden started out in the computing pool in 1967. This was really at the very end of the computing pool. But she worked in data analysis and fought to become an engineer and moved into the supersonic flight and sonic boom studies. And so what Dr. Darden did was she took the code, she took the theory about sonic boom minimization and used her computing skills to write a program that is still the basis of the first step of sonic boom modeling programs and in use today. And she was also the first African American here at Langley to be promoted into the senior executive service. So again, women are more than capable of not only doing the most intense technical work, but managing that work. So why does all of this matter? You know, every day I think you can open the newspaper, a different paper, and you can hear the discussion about women in science, why there aren't more women in science, why women aren't making it to the top in science, what can we do to create the pipeline to make it better and stronger for girls so that there are more women who make that decision to enter STEM fields when the time comes. This is why it's important. So 2018, that's just 4 years from now, there's a projected 1.2 million STEM job openings. How is the United States going to fill all of those jobs? It's going to be really incumbent upon us to draw from all of the talent, to find mathematicians, scientists, engineers, absolutely everywhere if we expect to fill those jobs. If we don't fill those jobs, the United States, of course, will fall behind in competitiveness on a global basis. So that's really what's at stake. Now, there are lots of organizations who are doing interesting things, both supporting women who are already in the sciences, like the Women at NASA program, but also creating the pipeline that is full of girls who are excited about science and technology. You know, many of these organizations, the Girl Scouts, I think really interestingly now, is putting a big emphasis on getting girls to be interested in science and technology from the time they're Brownie Scouts. And there are a number of success stories about colleges, higher education, who are churning out successful women in STEM. So Spelman College, it's a historically black college, all women in Georgia, sends more African-American women to STEM PhD programs than Georgia Tech, Duke, and UNC Chapel Hill combined. I think that's a really impressive stat. And their president, Dr. Beverly Tatum, recently won a $500,000 Carnegie Foundation grant for the work that she's done with STEM at her school and the success stories that she's enjoying. Another college is Harvey Mudd College in California. So women are just under half of the student body there, but their numbers, particularly in computer science, also in engineering, are almost proportionate with the number of women actually enrolled in the school. So, you know, there are people out there, and both of these, Harvey Mudd and Spelman College, are being looked at as models of how to get more women into the STEM fields in college. So there are lots of people trying to solve this problem, and these are just two that are having really, great success. But there's still the perception problem. Even as we talk about women who for more than 7 decades, I mean, there are even instances, for example, women were very involved as computers in the Harvard astronomy lab back in the late 1890s. So essentially, as long as there has been this practice of science and math, there have been women practicing science and math, but we still have this perception problem that both men and women assume that women, even capable women, are not capable, really, when it comes to doing these jobs. But I think one of the most powerful things that we can do is to tell these stories, to put it on the record, and these are just some of the recent instances in popular culture and books about computing in general. There's even a book that came out in 1995 about women at Dryden, NASA Dryden, and some of the work that they did. But it's something that people are beginning to be interested in, this work that women did, starting particularly in World War II, in the technical fields. And I think telling those stories is really a powerful way to say to women, this is open for you, because look, there are lots of women who have come before you and on whose shoulders you can stand. Now, when I first started this research, I looked up scientist in Google. And Google is like our hive mind. At this point, Google is the weighted average of what we're looking for and thinking about. And these are the images that come up, the top images for scientists. And of course, if you say scientist, probably all of us think something like this. A guy in a lab coat, and he looks like Einstein, he's got crazy hair. But fortunately for me, growing up here in Hampton, Virginia, I understood that this was also scientists, and all of these photos are pictures of women over time who have worked at NASA or the NACA. These are scientists too, and so what I'm really hoping to do is to show people and to get the stories of all of the women who have participated in this, so all of us understand that these are scientists too, and that women absolutely, positively do belong every place in the scientific process, and that we can look to those women pioneers for inspiration. So thank you very much. What I'd like to do now is just open the floor to any questions or comments. I know, I'm studying this history, but a lot of you here have lived this history and may have some comments. And if not, I also just want to say that I'm going to be here in town for the next 2 weeks, and what I'm really hoping to do is I've had interviews and I've spoken with many of you. I'm really hoping that I get a chance to interview more of you, and that is, if I could do that all day, every day while I'm here for the next 2 weeks, that would be great. So I will certainly make a point of speaking with you here after and making sure that we're in touch. And the other thing is, we are recording personal stories of women today. If there's anyone here who would like to say a few words on video, Scooter is going to be capturing video in the back, and we want to just, start the process while we have everyone here today of making sure that none of these stories fall by the wayside, and that any woman who wants to tell us about her experiences over the years working here and doing this important work has a chance to do so. So thank you very much.
On behalf of our Acting Center Director, Steve Jerzik, and the entire senior leadership team, I just want to thank you all for participating today. And we have a small token for Margot today. It's very small, but it reads, "Follow the trail to your dreams. Use the path of others' expectations, not the path of others' expectations." And I think you've done that. And we really do appreciate the history that you shared with us today and the ladies who made that history. We can't thank you enough. Another round of applause for the ladies. All right. Could all of the computers please stand? Or raise your hand. You can do that too. All of you, raise your hand. This is amazing. We have history in this room. I don't know if we grasp the concept. I don't know if we grasp fully how amazing to have these ladies in our presence is, how amazing it is to have these ladies in our presence. Take advantage of this opportunity. Speak to them. Get to know them. Get some of that, rub some of that off on you, that motivational spirit. Thank you again, and I appreciate it. Have a wonderful day.
Get the lists organized and make sure that all of the women, very important to this day, have got invitations and knew to come here. Gloria Champagne, with whom at this point I've spent many hours on the phone, and I'm looking forward to spending many hours in person, and who I think we probably met when I was much younger, and it's been wonderful to get to know you, and I look forward to spending more time together. And then very special thank yous to Miss Catherine Johnson and to Dr. Christine Darden, with whom at this point, I don't know how many hours I've spent with those two wonderful ladies, but they have shared their memories, their stories, and they have given me a real primer on aeronautics and space science, which was very much needed for me in doing this project. And then the final thank you I want to say, acknowledgement, is to a woman whose name is Beverly Galimba. Miss Galimba in 1990 had the foresight to record the stories of some of the computers, the ladies who worked here as computers at NACA and at NASA over the years, and understood that that was an important history. So she interviewed 13 of these women and wrote a
of aeronautics, astronautics, and modern computing. She is also author of the forthcoming book, Hidden Figures, a history of NASA's African-American female mathematicians. She's a native of Hampton, Virginia, the daughter of retired NASA Langley Research Center and research scientist, Dr. Robert Lee, and Bob also used to be the EEO director for a while in my office, a little bit before my time, but still, good guy, good guy. Thanks, Bob. And retired Hampton University English professor, Dr. Margaret G. Lee. Margot is also the co-founder of Inside Mexico, which from 2006 to 2009 was Mexico's most widely distributed English language publication. Margot is a 91 graduate of the University of Virginia. She currently lives in Valle de Bravo, Mexico, with her husband, Aaron. And now, without further ado, I present to you Margot Shetterly.
Thank you, Janet, for that amazing introduction. Good morning to everyone.
And to the world are just immeasurable. They're just absolutely immeasurable. And I'm just so pleased and so thrilled that so many ladies could come out today and celebrate with us. And I'd like to give them a round of applause right now. There's some special individuals I'd like to recognize. We are just absolutely thrilled to have Katherine Johnson and James Johnson here to celebrate with us. Dr. Christine Darden, Gloria Champagne, Billie Jean Neal, Sue Johnson, and Catherine Smith. We are just so excited that you guys could be with us today. Also, Michelle Woods Jones, the Executive Director of the Unity Commission for the City of Hampton. Thank you so much for attending our celebration today. And now on to a little bit about our guest speaker. Margot Lee Shetterly is a founder of the Human Computer Project, a digital archive dedicated to profiling all of the women who worked as computers at NASA and NACA. The project, a collaboration with Macalester College Professor of American Studies, Dr. Duchess Harris, explores the historical role of women in the development.
Thank you so much for coming out and joining us today. My name is Andrea Bynum. You see my name in the program beside welcome and introduction, so I will take care of that welcome. Thank you so much. I'm very excited about the presentation today. We have some folks here today that have been so nice in accepting our invitation to come out. I want to have Janet Sellers, the EEO director, to come. She's going to actually introduce our speaker today. And also we want to spend some time with a few special acknowledgments of those people who have blazed a trail for all of us who stand here today. Janet?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I am just so pleased to see the great turnout today for our special Women's History Month commemoration. The theme for Women's History Month is celebrating women of courage, character, and commitment. And there is no better way, I believe, to celebrate that theme than to recognize the women of NASA Langley Research Center and NACA, the contributions they have made to the Hampton Roads area, to the nation.
Happy spring. It's the first day of spring, and it feels a little bit like spring right now. And I also want to say thank you to all of the people who have really helped put this together today. At the top of the list, Andrea Bynum. Andrea has been incredible. Every single detail that has been involved with chasing this down and pulling this event together, she's handled it. And so I really want to say a special thank you to her. Also to Joanne Belshis and to Marie Heyman. I'm sorry if I'm getting the wrong names, not quite right, the last names, but I know we've only had a little bit of contact, but I know that you guys have also been working really hard on this event, and I thank you very much for making it happen. Mary Gaynor, who couldn't be here today, Mary is the Langley NASA historian. And Mary not only supported this event today, but for the last 2 years, she's been very helpful in terms of helping me with the research in the archives here, digging into the documents and really understanding this history. So I want to say a thank you to Mary. Also to Donna Speller-Turner, who has been just so energetic and very helpful in terms of helping me to